Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Duncan Brown, and I am a trustee with the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. I hope this webinar finds all of those tuned in safe and well tonight. Before I introduce Dr. Audrey Cronin, a quick announcement regarding the logistics for tonight's webinar. We are using the Zoom webinar platform tonight, so everyone is automatically muted and will stay muted. Additionally, the only persons you should see on your screen will be myself or Dr. Cronin. Tonight's webinar will include remarks by Dr. Cronin, followed by a Q&A session. Audience questions will be handled through the Q&A function in Zoom. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. What you can do is click on that button, type in your question, and just simply hit return. Please do note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs YouTube website in about 2 weeks. And now to tonight's speaker. Dr. Audrey Cronin is the founding director of the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology at American University in Washington, D.C. She is also a professor at American University School of International Service. Her career has combined academic positions and government service. She was a faculty member and director of the core course on war and statecraft at the U.S. National War College and was the academic director of studies for the changing character of war at Oxford University. Before that, she was a specialist in terrorism at the Congressional Research Service and was responsible for advising members of Congress in the aftermath of 9/11. She has also served in the U.S. executive branch, including the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy, and frequently advises at very senior levels. Dr. Cronin is also an award-winning author. Her latest book, Power to the People: How Open Technological Innovation is Arming Tomorrow's Terrorists, was published by Oxford University Press last year, and it analyzes the risks and opportunities of new and emerging technologies, including mobilizing people via social media and web platforms. The book won the 2020 Ari Neve International Prize for the most significant, original, relevant, and practically valuable contribution to the understanding of terrorism. Dr. Cronin received her undergraduate degree from Princeton University and was a Marshall Scholar, and she received her master's and doctorate degrees in international relations from Oxford University. Please join me to give a warm, albeit virtual, welcome to Dr. Audrey Cronin. And ma'am, over to you.
Thank you so much, Duncan. I'm delighted to be here back at the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. I'd like to thank you, Duncan, and also Mr. Frank Bird, whom I remember fondly from the last time I visited. And I hope that you're doing well. Thank you very much, all of you in the audience, for attending. I'm grateful for your presence. Feel honored that you have come to listen. And I hope that you're in good health. How much I wish that we were all in person, because I would love to see you all and be able to respond more directly to questions and comments as we go along. But we'll do the best we can with this virtual format. So what you see here is a picture of the aftermath of the bombing of the J.P. Morgan building at the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street in New York City in September of 1920, so just over 100 years ago. The explosion killed at least 40 people and seriously injured more than 200. On the next time you're visiting New York, hopefully after all of this shutdown is over, if you look carefully, you can still see the pockmarks in that corner building. So how could this have happened? Well, it was caused by a dynamite bomb, hidden in a horse-drawn cart under a pile of cast iron window sash weights. It was one of many attacks that happened between 1867 and 1934 on every continent except Antarctica as part of the first modern global terrorist movement, the Anarchist Wave. And Alfred Nobel's invention of dynamite sparked it all. Oops. So what does this have to do with us today? We're in the middle of a digital revolution. Everything from our jobs to our appliances, our logistical supply chains, how we interact, how we learn, how we engage in politics, and especially how we fight with each other is changing. And that change and disruption is accelerating as a result of the pandemic, making us more dependent on digital technology than ever. So my goal in Power to the People, the book I'm going to tell you a little bit about, was to anticipate how terrorists and other non-state actors will use new and emerging technology. In the past, they've almost exclusively relied upon guns and bombs. In fact, that's the cliche. They'll always be dependent on guns and bombs. And frankly, for the most part, they will. But what about other potential technologies in addition? Will they continue mainly to rely upon these earlier primitive technologies, or will they find some of our emerging technologies attractive? So the central question is, how and why have terrorists chosen new technologies over the centuries? And what can that tell us about how they'll behave going forward? So to answer it, in the next 30 minutes or so, I'll cover three big subjects: the nature of innovation in our current era, the history of how technology diffuses in political violence, and then finally, how technology is already changing political violence and what we can anticipate in the future. So first, the big question, the big context, the nature of innovation today. I'm going to lay out a contrast between open and closed technological revolutions. A closed technological revolution is what we had during the 20th century, with the concentrating of state power and the dawning of the nuclear age. In a closed technological revolution, military or scientific elites can limit the availability of new technologies, things like nuclear weapons, battleships, satellites, jet fighters, or even radar. These are expensive, rare, and difficult to build. These technologies require high levels of expertise and are carefully protected by things like security classifications or copyrights. And we speak of proliferation of these technologies and use phrases like dual use, meaning that they have two types of users, civilian and military. And that's the model of military technology that dominated throughout the last century. So think Albert Einstein or maybe J. Robert Oppenheimer, working away secretly in his lab with a small team of scientists developing the nuclear bomb. That's the iconic image. Then we opened Pandora's box. At the end of the 20th century, the United States consciously shifted from closed technological development to open development, spurred by the post-Cold War euphoria about a US-dominated New World Order. Perhaps it was inevitable. For example, a key element in the decision to go toward commercial development was that the cost of microelectronics was sharply declining, and DoD simply couldn't buy enough to shape the market around its own needs. Nonetheless, the overall result was dramatic. Virtually all of the major technological changes we're experiencing today were driven by publicly financed basic and applied research that first happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then they were shared beginning in the 1990s, in about 1993, I would say. So the examples are familiar. ARPANET became the internet, tax dollars developed GPS, NASA and the US Air Force drove the development of microprocessors, Google built their search engine with the funding from a National Science Foundation grant. Virtually all of the major components of smartphones come from US government-funded programs, including microchips, touchscreens, even voice-activated systems like Siri and Alexa. Now, that's not to take away from brilliant innovations that happened in Silicon Valley and Seattle, or in Bill Gates's parents' garage, or Mark Zuckerberg's dorm room at Harvard. But the US government consciously funded and shared these basic technologies, and as a result, what we have now, 30 or more years later, is the maturing of an open technological revolution. In an open technological revolution, there's popular access to advanced lethal technologies. You don't have to be a nuclear scientist to use them. You don't even have to fully understand them, because digital platforms are designed to help people experiment. Individuals and private groups are free to buy, use, and distribute these technologies, and also to invent new purposes for them, new forms of them, new surprise combinations of them. They spread via commercial processes. They can be accessed, bought, sold, used, combined, and changed. So in this kind of revolution, a much broader range of people is involved. It's not just military, civilian, dual use. There are four kinds of users: professionals, professional consumers or prosumers, hobbyists, and regular consumers. So it's way beyond just military and civilian. I think we need to update this framework of dual use. Anyway, that changes the equation of who can use new tools, where, when, why, and how, and it has an impact on the causes and the frequency of conflict, well beyond what happens on a battlefield. Mind you, we still have to focus on the technologies that elites are building at the high end, like the artificial intelligence arms race between the United States and Chinese militaries, and nuclear weapons. Again, that's the high end of technological change, and it's important. Nothing that I'm going to say in the next several minutes changes any of that. But we also need to consider low-end revolutionary technologies that are causing broader societal change. They're affecting patterns of conflict, especially in terrorism, insurgency, mass shootings, insurrections, and other types of individual and small group violence that have an impact, especially a political impact. Looking through the history of warfare, key watersheds have resulted from a shift in who can use new weapons and show up to fight, not just from which side has the most technologically advanced or more powerful means. So the last time we had this kind of open technological revolution was at the end of the 19th century, when the Second Industrial Revolution matured. And like today, there were changes in global patterns of technological innovation, trade, and communications. Like today, there was also giddy optimism about technology and no clear dividing line between amateur and professional scientific communities. Today, members of the public are free to purchase fairly capable drones, build robots, or buy primitive gene splicing kits and learn how to use them on the internet. During the late 19th century, they could buy cheap wiring kits, chemicals, and high explosives, along with instructions from new journals that were founded specifically to serve the amateur, the journals like Scientific American and Popular Science. A remarkable range of innovations emerged from the work of tinkerers and hobbyists, and many of them then affected what happened in the First and Second World Wars. It's not that there's some kind of hermetic seal between what amateurs do and then what eventually can show up in military arsenals. For example, Italian electrician Guglielmo Marconi invented the radio in the late 1890s using homemade equipment that he built in the attic of his home. Orville and Wilbur Wright, you're very familiar with that story. They made the first powered, sustained, controlled flight in 1903. They were bicycle manufacturers, and they built the craft in their home workshop in Dayton, Ohio. And Alfred Nobel first tinkered with explosives in a shed in the backyard of the family home. And he eventually came up with two key inventions. The first was the blasting cap, which was a method of detonation used in everything from rapid fire artillery to atomic bombs. And the second is dynamite, which built the Panama Canal, but also launched the first global wave of modern terrorism. I think it can be argued that dynamite was crucial to the development of terrorism as we know it. So in short, just to sum up this first part, today's potentially lethal technologies are emerging in an open technological context. Many of them have a lot more in common with accessible lethal open technologies like dynamite or IEDs, more in common with those than they do with 20th century military technologies like nuclear weapons, aircraft carriers, jet fighters, and tanks. So that brings me to the second big question that I'm going to address. How does lethal technology spread in political violence? Well, to answer that, I have to dig a little bit more deeply into the story of dynamite. There's going to be a little history here, but I promise it'll come to the present day fairly quickly, and I hope you'll see why I'm going through this. Dynamite set off that first wave of modern terrorism known as the Anarchist Wave. It actually had social revolutionaries and nationalists in it too, but that was the name that was given it because it was primarily anarchists. It killed or injured thousands of civilians and contributed to a surge of assassinations from Russian Tsar Alexander in 1881, Alexander II, to the French president, the Spanish prime minister, the Italian king, and of course, US President McKinley in 1901. Those killings that happened with both guns and dynamite spread throughout Europe, destabilized governments, and culminated with the death of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the outbreak of World War I. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand should not have been a major event. There had been so many assassinations before of much more prominent people. It was the context in which it happened that was important. Newly laid underwater telegraph cables spread news of what were called dynamitings throughout the world. Stories with graphic details of dynamite bloodshed lured readers and sold newspapers, especially in the United States. It was an era of what was even then referred to as fake news. But they also inspired similar violence elsewhere. A crucial element in the global diffusion of dynamitings was the appearance of mass market newspapers and their sensationalized headlines. Coverage of dynamite attacks attracted new readers in droves, and papers cut their prices to optimize sales. In the United States, for example, between 1883 and 1895, the circulation of Pulitzer's newspaper, New York World, grew from 15,000 to 600,000, even though the paper only cost a nickel. It was the most profitable newspaper ever published. So there were three key factors: an accessible lethal technology whose sales were driven by market forces, a new communications vector, the telegraph and mass market newspapers by the end of the century, and then the global diffusion of individual and small group political violence. And I would point out that we have all three of those things today. So the global spread of terrorism was remarkable. For my book, we developed a database. I'm not going to go into all the data, it'll be boring, but we had a database of more than 1,000 dynamite attacks and studied their patterns between 1867 and 1934. And worldwide dynamitings killed people on every continent except Antarctica. We also studied, by the way, we studied explosives that did not spread and diffuse, things like gun cotton and ballistite, and tried to understand why that was. How did it all end? The British and the Europeans tamped down the killings through a combination of regulations and international police cooperation. Bombings peaked in the 1880s. You can see the spike on this chart. And then they dropped between 1897 and 1905. After the passage of national legislation against criminal use of explosives or incitement of violence, that kind of legislation was passed in Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, and a number of other European countries. The pattern in the United States was different. Beginning in 1907, the preponderance of dynamiting shifts to the Americas. And that's why you have that second big spike. That's mainly in the United States and some parts of South America. The federal government passed a series of laws against the immigration of anarchists, even though most dynamitings were carried out by people who were already living in the United States. Any regulation of explosives at all fell under local or state law and was usually not enforced. So it's an interesting case study because the people who stepped in 1907 were the American Railway Association, and they established a Bureau of Explosives. They got tired of having their freight cars blow up and having their people killed by accidental dynamite ignition. And they helped to regulate the transportation of dynamite between states. So it was a private response. Eventually, of course, the Federal Detective Service was established in 1908, and that ultimately became the FBI in 1935. So the second key historical case that shows tremendous diffusion and a very important role in the spread of political violence is the Kalashnikov. The second wave of modern political violence was an anti-colonial wave. It was also propelled by this newly accessible technology, the AK-47 assault rifle. Pressures for decolonization, of course, had deep roots, lots of political background to them, but there was very little ability to act. And after 1905, political independence movements surged, at least in part because they had access to the automatic Kalashnikov Model 1947 or the AK-47. There's a wonderful story about Mikhail Kalashnikov. I can't get into the details. It's in the book. Basically, he was a short, 5'3" tall Soviet tank driver who in 1941 was badly injured by the Nazis in the Battle of Bryansk. And according to Soviet legend, from his hospital bed, Kalashnikov decided to build a better defensive weapon to protect the Russian homeland. In any case, that's what the story is. There's a lot more material and information in the book about the other weapons designers that he worked with. But ultimately, the result was the AK-47. The genius of the gun was its simplicity. It was designed for illiterate, malnourished peasants who were conscripted into the Red Army. It was easy to carry, shorter than the infantry rifles that it replaced. It weighed only 10 pounds, and its parts were interchangeable gun to gun. It also rattled, was inaccurate, was shorter range than most of its competitors, and it was the butt of ridicule by firearms experts everywhere, especially in the United States and in Great Britain. But the AK-47 changed the world. Of course, terrorists had used firearms long before the invention of the AK-47, but they were expensive, difficult to maintain, and far more effective in the hands of well-trained professional soldiers who could keep them clean and take care of them. The AK-47 changed the equation. It soon became the most widely dispersed firearm in history, outstripping the next family of rifles, which is the American M16, by 5 or 10 times. We don't even know the exact numbers of AK-47s. There are so many, and they never seem to die. There are something like 70 to 100 million throughout the world. So tens of millions of them were manufactured, created, promoted, and distributed by the Soviet government, which, of course, if you'll recall, did not believe in patents. They were not a member of the International Patent Agreement, and basically bartered the weapon for political influence or hard currency. That made the AK-47 unusual in the 20th century. Kalashnikov factories proliferated around the world in a way that other firearms did not. Other people got these factories and manufactured it, altered it, and copied it, and then distributed it and treated it as essentially an open technological platform. So now I'm just going to click very quickly through. This is a bunch of data too, but there's a little red dot on your screen, and you can see the date on the far right bottom. This is before 1955. The AK-47 was first invented and manufactured in Izhevsk, Russia. And then I'll go quickly through the proliferation and spreading of AK-47, well, Kalashnikov factories that happen throughout the world. You see the little red dots that show up in Eastern Europe and then over in China, and then continuing on. See, that's 1955 to 1960. And then more red dots that we're beginning to get into Scandinavia. And you can see down in Southeast Asia. And then between 1971 and now, there are red dots all over the place. And oh, by the way, the most Kalashnikovs of any country are produced currently in the United States. So, like dynamite, the rifle developed symbolic resonance, and that helped it spread through global communications, including magazines and television. This is the first known picture of a revolutionary who's toting an AK-47. And ironically for the Soviet Union, it was during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. And this fella, Joseph Tibor Fayes, had probably gotten his from a dead Soviet soldier. The Soviet troops were required to carry their guns literally in bags because they didn't want to get the secret of the design of the gun to spread to the West or anywhere else. But he acquired that gun somehow, and this picture was taken. And after the Hungarian Revolution failed, he was actually executed in part on the evidence of this picture. But let's compare it to a more recent example. It was not by accident that every major address that Osama bin Laden gave included a later version of the Kalashnikov, and that's the AKS-74U, or the Krinkov, which is mainly used by paratroopers. It's prominently displayed against the wall behind him. So the rate of success in insurgencies increased in the aftermath of the Second World War, going from less than 25% between 1775 to 1945 to more than 40% success from 1945 to the present. And that's a conservative estimate. There are other studies that actually consider insurgency to have a higher success rate than 45%. And again, as I said earlier, there are 70 to 100 million Kalashnikovs distributed throughout the world today. The point is that open lethal technologies have patterns of spread. Those that are attractive to terrorists have patterns of spread that we can trace. We can understand and anticipate both which technologies spread and also which ones don't spread. They're driven by market forces, and the ability to diffuse or spread is in many ways much more important than the ability to innovate when it comes to political violence. So disruptive lethal technologies that spread, and this is sort of a no-brainer because it's the same things that cause things to spread if they're commercially driven. Disruptive lethal technologies that spread are accessible, cheap, simple to use. And you can read this slide. I'm not going to read it out loud to you. But ultimately, a key element is that they're not cutting edge. They tend to be in the second or third wave of innovation. And remember that I said that many of the technologies that we're developing now were first developed in the mid-20th century. So many of them are in the second or third wave of their innovation. They're also symbolically resonant. And this is not as closely tracked with commercial spread. And they're part of a cluster of other emerging technologies. And that's one of the things that makes them attractive to those who engage in political violence. So to sum up, open technological innovation of potentially lethal technology through commercial processes changes political violence just as it does every other element of our lives. And we can anticipate which technologies are most likely to diffuse. So that brings me to the last question, and I hope this is the pay dirt for you because we're going to talk about what's going on today. What technology-driven changes can we anticipate now and in the future? Open innovation and diffusion of new technologies is driving changes in global political violence across three key functions: how people radicalize and mobilize for violence. This is the one that gets all the attention because it's the most obvious to us. Secondly, how they project power, or what the military calls reach. And then third, how they integrate complex systems. So I'm going to go through each of these quickly and give you some examples. Beginning with open innovation of mobilization and radicalization. It's not unusual to use new means of communication to recruit or train people in terrorism. In the 19th century, the anarchists published pamphlets with detailed instruction booklets on how to acquire and use dynamite. But what's new today, of course, is the scale and scope. Everyone has a powerful computer in their pockets, and there's mass interactivity, robotic replication of messages, live streaming of attacks, like the attack in Christchurch. High quality first-person filmmaking that makes anyone a television producer. For example, Al-Shabaab was the first jihadist group to live tweet an operation, and its September 2013 attack on the Westgate shopping mall in Nairobi, Kenya, reached an audience of millions, and then others began to copy. Radicalization is also easier and faster. It used to take people at least 18 months to be radicalized. Now we're seeing radicalization in a matter of weeks. So for example, the conspiracy, the QAnon conspiracy, people have been radicalized in a matter of just a few weeks. And there's also greater potential to be individually recruited and groomed. Algorithms help people discover other groups with which they might have an affinity. In the United States, groups like Patriot Prayer, Proud Boys, the Incels, Kenosha Guard, the Boogaloo Movement, and Antifa. And online sites like 4chan, 8kun, Telegram, Reddit, Discord, the Donald.win, there's a whole long list I could give you. All of these have boosted militia movements in places like Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Oregon. The Islamic State's use of strategic communication has been probably its most important asset. They used it to recruit and attract resources, to justify and legitimize their violence, and to intimidate the civilian population. Other groups and individuals have copied them. For example, HTS, which is the successor to al-Nusra, which is the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. HTS uses a Call of Duty motif that you also see directly copied from ISIS. Strategic communications have become central to Salafi jihadists, including effective use of videographers, producers, and editors. With the global spread of digital communications and encrypted and encrypted apps, it's difficult to carry out counterterrorism operations in secret. And tactical successes can be strategic disasters. Plus, terrorist groups and proxy armies also have the means to carry out attacks at greater distances now. And that leads us to the second big trend, open innovation of reach or power projection. This has been developing for a while. People are combining clusters of technologies to create something new. Small UAVs or drones, quadcopters, robots, 3D printing, and nascent autonomy can easily combine to offer extended reach to a much broader range of actors. The Islamic State used fixed-wing small drones and quadcopters for propaganda, reconnaissance, especially aerial filming of attacks, so that also helped with radicalization and popularization. Attack management, so here they were using reconnaissance by quadcopters to see where vehicles or other obstacles were parked when they were trying to get through towns and cities like Mosul. They also delivered small payloads on quadcopters. This was nothing of a threat when it came to major conventional forces, but what they were doing was hurting and intimidating Iraqi civilians, and they had a very powerful political effect as a result. In 2017, Ukrainian separatists used small drones to drop thermite grenades on ammunition depots. Larger drones have been used to drop heavier munitions, as happened in Syria. And we're also seeing simple armed drones used by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Just this past November, a weaponized DJI Matrix 210 quadcopter was able to drop munitions on the bodyguards of the governor of Kunduz. The bodyguards were out in his complex playing volleyball, and those munitions killed a number of people. Simple systems can have an enormous impact on partners like the Afghan security forces. Counter drone technology is expensive. Most systems are $100,000 or more. Countering drones in large areas costs multiple millions. Partners can't afford that. And they're hard to shoot down. They're small and they're difficult to spot. More serious military-grade UAVs are now at use in at least 18, 20 countries. Many are sold by China, but also Israel and Turkey. That's where Azerbaijan got them for their use against Armenia just last year. They're cheap enough that non-state actors and proxy armies also easily get them, as we've seen with the Houthis in Yemen. Drones are a poor person's air force. Another aspect of reach is facial recognition technology, which is becoming widely accessible to individuals and terrorists to identify targets for killing. I don't have an example of this yet, thank God, but it meets all the criteria, and I think it's virtually inevitable coming in the future. And then there's additive manufacturing or 3D printing. It's not a new technology by any means. Additive manufacturing is actually very old, but it's enhanced by the ability to share online digital CAD files. For example, via Keybase, which is an encrypted platform, and they actually kicked a 3D printing group off. But it's very easy to start your own website then after that. There's a serious problem of ghost guns that my law enforcement friends tell me about and they're very worried about. There's been symbolic use of 3D printed parts, for example, in the attack in Halle, Germany in October of 2019 that killed several people. And it was an attack on a synagogue, as I recall. And unfortunately now the ability to use 3D printing to print more effective guns is increasing, just even in the last few months. It used to be that 3D printed guns were just much more dangerous to the person using them because they were not made of strong enough material and they might blow up in the person's hands. But unfortunately, that's no longer the case. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that. Then meanwhile, we're also much more vulnerable targets. This is kind of one of these bit overstated slides. It's very difficult to show pictures of cyber physical systems, but the point is that appliances and devices that are equipped with hackable sensors are proliferating, and they receive and transmit data without human involvement. So the Internet of Things, or the Internet of Everything, cyber physical systems are becoming ubiquitous. You might have noticed the cyber hack of the Oldsmar, Florida water system just a couple of weeks ago. There was a nefarious actor who took over the system, and it was an insider job. They probably think it was old software. It was not state-of-the-art stuff, but it was a serious threat. Fortunately, it was discovered right away. I think in many cases we don't hear about a lot of the hacks that happen, but the result is the same. There are significant vulnerabilities in our infrastructure. When you think about all of these individual, water organizations throughout our country. So how do we handle all that data and technology? Well, that brings us to the third trend, and that's systems integration and autonomy. Our systems are becoming so complex, fast, data-rich, and advanced that human intelligence can't integrate and manage them. So the answer is to build in degrees of autonomy, meaning that the machine is able to sense the environment, process what is happening, and act without direct human involvement. So simple forms of autonomy and artificial intelligence are becoming cheaper, much more accessible, much more potentially lethal. Jihadists and other terrorists have shown interest in autonomous systems. And remember that in an open technological environment, whatever the United States does becomes a demonstration project that is copied. And don't forget that data is the source of power for machine learning. And although there is not much accessibility to that kind of broad data by non-state actors, simple autonomy is much more accessible. Okay, so just to sum up, in the 20th century, it required a national army to do all of these things: mobilization, reach, and systems integration. Now, individuals or small groups, including terrorists, can do them all. Terrorists and proxy armies don't have the ability to go toe-to-toe with the United States in order to have a huge political impact. They don't need to. They can change the outcome of a conflict by having an enormous political impact upon civilian populations. So the point is that we know what kinds of technological changes are most likely to lead to destabilizing political violence. We can foresee which technologies have characteristics that will make them diffuse through commercial processes in an open technological context. And so you ask, so what, right? On this slide, what are the practical implications? What are the threat vectors? And these are before you. The first is individuals, which would include mass shooters, bombers, slashers, incels, jihadist-inspired individuals. And the second is terrorists. We've covered that reasonably well already. Jihadists, right-wing groups, left-wing groups, extreme nationalists, a large range of small groups, hackers, cyber criminals, extortionists, exploit hackers, black hatters, cyber mercenaries, and private armies. And I would include here proxy armies, so state proxies. Again, there's no hermetic seal between non-state actors and state actors. The Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Donetsk People's Republic militias, mercenaries. And then finally, going to the bottom of the screen, we have organized crime, which I did not cover, but includes things like money laundering, human trafficking, drugs, and the full range of activity on the dark net. And so you have the appearance of these types of warfare, these types of conflict. It's not just terrorism. The line between state and non-state actors is blurred by the use of new technologies whose accessibility and effective use is also blurred. So what are we going to do about it? I'll address this much more in the Q&A. Here are some, pictures to just represent the big things that need to happen. We need public regulations, global agreements, voluntary restraints by the private sector, much more education. We have to develop countermeasures to the downside risks of products that are already in use. We have to build countermeasures and an understanding of nefarious uses into the development of new technologies so as to maximize the opportunity and minimize the risks. We can't eliminate those downside risks, and I'm not arguing that we should slow innovation down in order to do so, but we can recognize them and we can reduce them. Because ultimately, if you have a major disaster, you're going to have an enormous impact on innovation anyway. Widespread ability to mobilize, project power, and integrate systems is already weakening democratic states from within, and it could set off interstate wars in the future. So the point is that I feel that we need to move forward. We need to have the ability to face the downside risks of innovation, to minimize them, not because we're slowing people down, not because we're trying to claim that we shouldn't be developing autonomous systems and cutting edge systems with our military, but because we have a political aspect to these technologies that is extremely important to consider. And just remember that in the last 15 years or so, the most powerful and the most influential technology with respect to its impact upon the American military was probably the IED. So that is the end of my prepared remarks, and I'm very eager to hear your questions or comments.
Audrey, thank you very much. So the first one is we obviously have a recent National Intelligence Council report that just came out a few days ago that was declassified, and it discusses, amongst other things, how the Russians sought to foment dissent in the US through the spread of disinformation, often by enlisting US officials, citizens, and news organizations to spread that misinformation. And so the question is, how do we fight that tactic and those sorts of attacks, but yet not stifle free speech? Where's the balance there, and how do we deal with that?
Yeah, that's an extremely important question. And I think it's the most important question in the United States, because the greatest threat, I believe, is our domestic polarization and the fact that our democracy is under threat from forces from within. So how do we fight that? One way is that we have much better education. I know this sounds, sort of pie in the sky, but I am an educator. And one of the reasons why I write about these things is because I do truly believe that making people more aware of being much smarter and more discriminating consumers of news and accessible information on the internet is something that we have to do. The second thing I would say is that the First Amendment is an extraordinarily and very precious, very important part of our civil liberties and freedom, but it is not now and never has been completely with no constraints whatsoever. When the First Amendment bleeds over into situations where people are inspired to kill or they're incited to kill, we have to have the ability to have measures against that incitement. And I do believe that the platforms, the major technology platforms, including Facebook and Twitter and many of the other big tech organizations, understand that their responsibility is to be sure that they're not carrying information on their platforms that is going to lead to this kind of harm. So they're building in much more discriminating algorithms. They also use moderators. I mean, this is nibbling around the edges of what is a much bigger problem, but I think we're going to have to continue in that direction.
Okay, thank you. Then the next one is, you discussed guns and bombs as, as the terrorist killing weapons of choice, and in some ways they still are, because they're simple, they can be counted on to work. But what are your thoughts on terrorists seeking to acquire, say, nuclear, chemical, bioweapons, as they generally seem to be a lot more complex and in many cases often the province of only nation states?
Yes, they have been. And definitely that's the case for nuclear weapons. Chemical weapons, probably, especially in terms of delivery. Bioweapons, I'm very worried about bioweapons. The reason I'm worried about bioweapons is not that, so you need to have intent and also capability if you're a terrorist organization or a small group or even an insider threat or individual who wants to use that kind of a weapon, who wants to engage in bioterrorism. Intent has been demonstrated for a long time. There was Shinrikyo, Al-Qaeda was interested in bioterrorism. ISIS had some primitive bioterrorism labs that showed intent. So intent has been there all along. That hasn't changed so much, not yet. although I will have a caveat about the pandemic in a minute. But what has really changed is the threshold for accessibility to these technologies. You now have, with the biotechnology revolution, you essentially have the ability to read, which is DNA sequencing, and write, which is DNA synthesizing, the tools of life. And then that reading and writing can now appear on the internet. So you can get access to the sequence of a deadly virus, of a pathogen, and you can now create or recreate that known pathogen. But you can also potentially, the other thing that worries me is you can potentially synthesize simple bacteria or viruses that could be deadly. And it's easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but and I'm not saying that terrorist groups are extremely capable at this point, but the threshold for that expertise has lowered. You've got a much broader involvement in SynBio, for example. Most of that is really great. I mean, you've got kits that you can buy and use in high school classrooms for $169. You've got home laboratory SynBio setups that you can get for less than $2,000 now. It's good. I think the makers movement and having people involved in understanding more about biology is in general good, but we're not fully screening everyone who has access to these capabilities. And I think we should be. So I'm concerned, and it is very true, Duncan, that the people who are most capable are still states. And so throughout this whole presentation, I'm not trying to minimize the important role of preventing the proliferation of bioweapons through agreements between states. That is far more important. However, we've also got this threat that's coming from below, and it requires less training, and there's more accessibility to the tools to carry it out.
So the next one revolves around software. So open source software. And for folks who don't know what that is, that means software that's used on computers, that's developed out in the open with lots of people contributing to its development. It's a great benefit, obviously, to the US, to the world, to our allies and partners, but it also has some trouble that may come with that benefit. And as an example of that, we have various tool suites, for example, that are important to the US military. And sometimes these tool suites are created by partner or allied companies. So companies in other nations that are allies and partners to us. And a classic one here is that they list as Atlassian, which I'm not familiar with. But basically, it's an Australian company that developed it. It's used by the United States. And so the question is that company can be under pressure, say by the Chinese. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with stuff that's created by companies in allied nations or partner nations that may come under pressure?
Well, I think we hope the Australians resist the pressure. The Australians are very close allies and part of our Five Eyes alliance, and I don't think that the answer is to prevent them from developing great software tools, but I do think that we should be able to develop more effective counters to the kinds of pressures that the Chinese are putting them under. I mean, open source software has deep pros and cons. I mean, it's extremely creative, innovative. You get wonderful new ideas, but again, it's going to be more hackable. But that's the case with most of our software. Unfortunately, it's only a matter of degree. It's not a matter of an on-off switch.
So the next one is, and this kind of comes back to these sorts of things, and whether it's in the US or with allies or partners, is there a way to protect what we create?
Yes. The way to protect what we create is to make sure that we have either self-restraint or smart development, or in some cases, yes, I'll use the R word. People hate the word regulation, but we have regulation of airliners and flights. Would you feel safe getting onto a commercial airliner that was not under some kind of regulation? We develop smart regulations in conjunction with those that are building the technologies, regulations that reduce the downside. Now, let me go back to my history just for a minute. At the end of the 19th century, Alfred Nobel wanted to sell more dynamite in the UK, and they kept having accidents. And this was mainly because he wasn't allowed to transport dynamite by railway. And so individuals would take dynamite in, carts and all kinds of primitive means and bump it down a rocky road, and there were these huge horrible accidents. There was one in Wales that killed, just practically devastated a dozen people in a village, and it was horrible blowback against Alfred Nobel. So Nobel was begging the UK government for regulation because he wanted to sell more dynamite. He wanted to be able to sell dynamite to the British, in part also because this was a colonial empire and he could sell via the British to many other of members of the colonies, members of the colonial, the cooperative states that were buying things from the UK. And so what the UK did was it built an extremely smart set of regulations. Alfred Nobel played a role and had some input into those. And the regulations meant that dynamite was inspected by former military who had deep explosive experience in terms of understanding them. And they were the ones who decided whether or not a shipment could be traveling on a railway here or there. So Nobel, as a result, one of the reasons we have the Nobel Prizes is that he made money hand over fist, in partly helped by that kind of regulation. So what I'm saying is today we can do similar things, not regulation in every type of technology. We have to be specific about which ones we're talking about. But I do think that smart regulations should be part of the answer for how we best protect the positive opportunities and upsides of our technologies.
So the follow-on to that, and I'll give you an example here, is the next generation of cars. So think Tesla. So every Tesla has what is known as a digital twin. So in other words, you drive your Tesla and it reports back via the internet to its twin, which is basically a set of software on a computer. And that thing is analyzing how well the driver and the car are doing. And it's sending then upgrades back to the car, and presumably for your enhanced driving, for safety enhancements, et cetera. But there's a system that obviously can be hacked. Cars can be crashed or do things that you don't want them to do. How do you defend against that? Because now you're relying on somebody like Tesla to make sure that those systems are not screwed with, quite frankly.
Yes. So that's another thing that we need to build into our consumer products. So yes, I think that the ability to hack, that's been demonstrated. There was a Jeep Cherokee that was hacked and driven into a wall. And, so unmanned cars have been easily hacked, scarily hacked. And there hasn't been much incentive for companies. I'm not talking about Tesla per se. I'm not really expert enough in the specifics of what they've done in terms of protecting their system. But there hasn't been an incentive for most commercial companies to develop the kind of protection and safety in their systems because consumers don't have any understanding that they're vulnerable. So until something happens, until you're the guy in the Tesla that drives into a wall and Tesla gets sued, or perhaps there's an even bigger accident and many people die, it's after the fact that we finally have companies that are responding, or whichever company, maybe it's Jeep or maybe it's name another company. I'm not trying to pick on Tesla. My brother would kill me because he's a big fan of Teslas, but anyway, there are three things that you need. The first is you need companies to begin to see that it's commercially important for them to build security into their sensors and into their systems. The second thing is you need to have consumers who are wise enough to demand it. And the third thing is that there needs to be enough transparency in the consumer products that you buy that you know whether something has any sort of decent cybersecurity. And right now we don't have any of that. So for example, let me just give you a sort of a personal story. My husband and I bought a refrigerator. We had to buy a kind of a particular kind because it was fitting into a very tricky little spot. And I was insistent that we buy one that was not internet connected because I'm pretty sensitive on this question, the Internet of Things. I don't want sensors in my refrigerator reporting to the company from whom I bought it. And the person in the shop insisted that this one would not. So we bought the refrigerator, we had it installed, and my husband was in Japan. This was just over a year ago, before the pandemic. I went downstairs to get something out of the freezer and came back up to my desk. I was working, and I got a text from Tokyo, Japan, where my husband was, saying, "Audrey, did you leave the refrigerator, the freezer door open?" The company had indeed maintained internet connectivity, and it had texted my husband. And we think that the way that they did it was when they delivered the refrigerator, we had to put our personal information in, including email and telephone number. And that was all put into the database. And despite our wishes, that information was, it was still digitally and cyber connected. So it's very, very difficult to have the kind of transparency, even if you want it, even if you're looking for it. And I think we should be able, as consumers, to have that.
Yep, I agree. My dishwasher talks to my computer all the time for some reason, even though I don't want it to.
That's annoying, isn't it?
It's
and you
hooked
know
up
what
to the
else?
internet.
Yeah, there's one other thing I forgot. That's a fourth thing. All of the things that we buy should continue to work as they're supposed to work when the internet goes down.
Right. Yep.
And we don't have that now.
I agree. So I want to switch gears a little bit. So we talked about terrorists. So what generally is the source of funding? How do terrorists get their funding for, say, the acquisition of weapons or munitions or their daily operations? And so where does it come from, and how is it funneled to these groups? And the question used as an example, the rebels in Yemen or Somalia, Al-Shabaab, et cetera. And maybe they're different.
Yeah, it depends on the group, right? So you can have state funding that is sometimes clandestinely funneled to groups. Sometimes it's funding that is via the darknet through, collecting that kind of fund on the internet. A lot of funding just comes through old-fashioned means. There's moving cash around. We do have reasonably good, in the aftermath of September 11th, there was a tremendous impetus to build in controls on the traditional banking system. And those regulations are reasonably good. If it's going through the traditional banking system, it's usually tracked. But unfortunately, there are all kinds of ways to get around that now. We used to worry about, the black market peso system, the Hawala system, which is an informal bribery kind of bartering system, not bribery, bartering system. But now what we have is digital currencies like Bitcoin. So this is another way of getting around the traditional banking system that can suit people who are unbanked in underprivileged parts of the world. And it's got a wonderful aspect to it to be able to develop wealth without necessarily having to be disadvantaged by no infrastructure in your country. But the other side of it is that we're now seeing a growth of the use of digital currency by non-state groups, including terrorist groups.
Right. Okay, we're almost at our witching hour. And so I want to ask one final question. Good friend of mine over at the National Defense University has been quoted as saying that we used to hunt the IEDs, the improved explosive devices. Now the IEDs are hunting us.
Yes.
And so think of drones.
Yeah.
How are we going to defend against that in the future?
That is an extremely worrisome and important question. That's one of the reasons why I brought up the future of facial recognition technology, because that's the kind of system that could work with drones. I don't like to give ideas when I give my talks, so I'm always having to be a little euphemistic. Let me put it this way. There's an organization called the Future of Life Institute. And in 2017, they built a video. It was highly controversial. You'll have a lot of people arguing that it is accurate and others saying that it is very alarmist, but others will say that it's overstated and that we have defenses. I recommend that you look at this video. It's called Slaughterbots. It's only 8 minutes long. I have the students in my emerging technologies class looking at it this week and see what some of the nefarious uses of flying IEDs could be, and how do we defend against them? Well, there are lots of ways to defend against drones. You can jam them, you can have counter drone systems, but we're not going to have those systems all the time everywhere. Remember, I mentioned earlier how expensive they are. We're going to have them in high value, protecting high value targets, the obvious ones like the White House, the Pentagon, and so forth and so on. But you're not necessarily going to have that kind of protection in, I don't know, sort of Springfield, Iowa, somewhere, a small town. And I think it's a serious concern. I think we need to be able to build those defenses into the quadcopters themselves. They have to have some measures that prevent their use in nefarious ways. But that's a technological solution. And I think in that case, it's probably the only way we're going to defend against them.
Okay. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Cronin. This was terrific. It was a terrific seminar. And I want to, again, thank you very much for this. To our participants that are out there, thank you all for coming and joining us tonight. We appreciate you being here. Just to remind everybody, our next webinar is on the 13th of April. And Dr. Frank Miller will be here. He's from the Scowcroft Group, and we'll be talking about future U.S. nuclear weapons policy. And with that, to everyone, have a great night. Audrey, again, thank you. And everybody, please stay safe and well.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Good night.
Good night.